I was sitting at a red light on Meridian Street, maybe 2 blocks from the hardware store, when I saw her. My daughter-in-law was standing on the median strip with a cardboard sign. She was holding my grandson against her chest with one arm, the sign with the other. He had no jacket on. It was 41 degrees. I almost didn't recognize her. Her hair was matted. She was wearing the same green coat I'd seen her in at Thanksgiving, except now it had a tear along the shoulder seam and what looked like a grease stain across the front. My grandson's face was buried against her neck. He was 2 years old. I rolled down my window. I said her name. She looked up, and I saw her face change, that split second when a person doesn't know whether to feel relief or shame. She felt both. I could see it. "Where's my son?" I asked. She started to cry before she could answer. My son Everett was 34 years old. He worked in commercial HVAC, had his own small company, 3 employees, a good reputation around Indianapolis. He'd built it from nothing after he left the military. 8 years in the Army, 2 deployments, came home quieter than he left but steadier too. He met his wife Nora at a church cookout in Carmel about 6 years ago. She was sweet, he said. She made him laugh. I liked Nora in the beginning. I want to be honest about that. She had a warmth to her that felt real. When my wife Irene passed 3 years ago from pancreatic cancer, Nora was the one who sat with me in the hospital waiting room and held my hand and didn't say a single useless thing. She just sat there. I respected that. What I didn't see, what none of us saw, was the woman standing beside her, her mother, Patrice. Patrice moved up from Louisville about 8 months after the wedding, said she needed to be closer to family. Nora was an only child, and the 2 of them were tight in a way that I understood, but that Everett, I think, underestimated. Patrice was one of those women who smiles at you while she's working. You never see the hands moving. She moved into the spare bedroom of their house on Kessler Boulevard, Everett's house. The house I'd helped him put the down payment on when he got back from his second tour. $62,000 that Irene and I had saved over 30 years of careful living. Patrice was supposed to stay 2 months. That was the agreement, Everett told me later. 2 months turned into 6. 6 turned into 2 years. I didn't notice the changes all at once. That's the thing nobody tells you. It doesn't happen like a switch flipping. It happens the way rust does, slow, underneath, and by the time you see it on the surface, the damage is already done. Everett stopped returning my calls as fast. That was the first thing. He'd always been good about that, even overseas. 30 minutes, an hour at most, he'd call back. Then it started becoming the next day. Then sometimes not at all. When I'd visit, Patrice was always there, always in the kitchen, always at the table, always somehow in the room. She'd smile at me and offer coffee and say nice things, and Everett would sit across from me with a look on his face that I can only describe as managed, like a man being careful. I asked him once, just the 2 of us on the back porch, if everything was all right. He said yes. He said Nora had been stressed since the baby came and that he was just trying to keep the peace. I told him keeping the peace and losing yourself were 2 different things. He nodded like he heard me. I don't think he believed me yet. My grandson Cooper was born in the spring of that second year. I was in the waiting room with Nora's aunt and 2 of Everett's Army buddies. Patrice was in the delivery room. I was not. I told myself that was fine. Nora wanted her mother there. That was natural, but something about the way Patrice came out and announced the news, like it was hers to give, sat wrong with me. I didn't say anything. I held Cooper for the first time and thought about Irene, how much she would have loved this. I focused on that. It was Everett's friend and former Army buddy, a man named Gideon, who called me first. Gideon had known Everett since Fort Benning. He was straight as a rail, no drama in him. He didn't call to gossip. He called because he was scared. "I took Everett to lunch last Tuesday," he said. "He looked wrong, sir. He told me he signed the business over." I asked him what he meant. Signed the business over to Nora and Patrice. He said it was for tax purposes, but the way he said it, I don't think he wanted to. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that call. The clock on the microwave said 7:14. It stayed 7:14 for what felt like forever. I called Everett, straight to voicemail. I called the house phone, the one I'd bought them when they moved in because Irene was old-fashioned about landlines. A recording said the number had been disconnected. I drove to Kessler Boulevard that same night. The lights were on. I knocked. Patrice answered. She told me Everett wasn't home. I asked when he'd be back. She said she wasn't sure. She smiled the whole time. I drove around the block and parked where I could see the driveway. Everett's truck was right there, same as always, the magnetic logo on the side. Briggs HVAC Solutions. He was home. He just wasn't allowed to come to the door. I want to be careful about how I tell this part, because I've turned it over in my head 1,000 times, and I still feel the same thing I felt then, which was not anger, not yet, but a cold, settling dread. The kind you feel when you finally admit something to yourself that you'd been refusing to see. My son was a prisoner in his own home, not with bars, with guilt, with isolation, with a woman who'd systematically cut him off from everyone who loved him and replaced that love with dependency, with a mother-in-law who had moved into his house and was now running his business and controlling who he spoke to and when. I found out later, piece by piece, the full picture. Everett had signed a general power of attorney 18 months earlier. Nora had presented it as a practical matter, something to do with managing accounts while he was focused on the business. He trusted her. He signed it. With that document, Nora and Patrice had refinanced the house, pulling out $200,000 in equity. The HVAC business had been restructured with Nora as primary owner, Patrice listed as operations manager. Everett was still going to work every day, driving his own truck, servicing his own clients, but he was, legally, an employee. His direct deposit paychecks went into an account he no longer had access to. He had a prepaid card with a weekly allowance, $200, for a man who'd built a business from the ground up. When he'd tried to push back, Nora had cried. Patrice had said he was being selfish, that he didn't care about his family's security, that real men didn't keep money from their wives. And Everett, my son who'd done 2 tours, who'd come home and built something real, who still woke up some nights from things he'd seen, had believed them. Because he was tired. Because he loved Nora, or who he thought Nora was. Because they'd made him believe that his instincts were the problem. He didn't call me because Patrice had told Nora, and Nora had told Everett that I had never liked Nora, that I'd said things, that I was trying to break up their family. None of it was true, but when you're isolated and exhausted, and the only voices you hear all day are telling you the same thing, truth starts to sound like something that happened to someone else. I went to see a family law attorney in Broad Ripple named Caldwell, not from my son's list, a name I found through a retired judge I used to do work for back when I was still contracting. I brought everything I knew. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start. Caldwell told me that the power of attorney could potentially be challenged on the grounds of undue influence, that if we could demonstrate Everett had been isolated and manipulated when he signed it, a court might invalidate it. The business restructuring was more complex. The house refinance was worse. But nothing was irreversible, he said, if we moved carefully. Carefully was the key word. He referred me to a private investigator, a woman named Iris who worked out of a small office in Broad Ripple and who had the energy of someone who'd heard every version of every bad story and had stopped being surprised but had never stopped being thorough. She met me on a Thursday and took notes in a small green notebook and asked questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. Within 3 weeks, Iris had documented several things. Patrice had a history in Louisville, a civil suit from a previous employer, dismissed but on record. Nora had opened accounts at two separate banks in the months before Everett signed the POA. There were property records showing transfers and a Shell LLC registered in Indiana with Patrice as registered agent. None of it was subtle once you knew where to look. It was the kind of fraud that doesn't bother to hide because it assumes nobody is going to look. They assumed wrong. The reason Nora was on that median strip with Cooper was this: Everett had found out. Not from me, not yet, from a client. One of his longtime clients, a commercial property manager named Stu, who'd been using Briggs HVAC for 5 years, had called the business line to complain about an invoice. When Everett looked into it, he realized a job he hadn't done, a job he hadn't even been sent to, had been billed under his name at double the normal rate. The money had gone somewhere he couldn't trace. He'd confronted Nora. It had escalated. He'd gone looking through the files they kept in the basement office, his own house, his own company, and Patrice had physically blocked the door. When he'd pushed past her, Nora had called 911 and told them he was being violent. He spent the night in the Marion County Jail. No charges were filed. He was released in the morning. When he went back to the house, the locks had been changed. He'd been sleeping in his truck for 11 days. He didn't call me because he didn't know if I would believe him. That's the part that still costs me sleep. My son, who I would have given everything, who I nearly did give everything, didn't know if his own father would believe him because they had done that thorough a job. When I finally reached him, through Gideon, who'd spotted the truck parked behind a speedway off Michigan Road, he couldn't look me in the eye for the first few minutes. He just sat in the passenger seat of my truck and stared at the dashboard. I didn't say anything. Sometimes you just have to let a person be where they are. Eventually he said, "Dad, I think I lost everything." I said, "Not yet, you haven't." We moved Everett into my house that same night. The guest room, the one where Cooper had slept when Nora brought him over for visits. I made up the bed with the good sheets Irene always kept in the cedar closet. I don't know why that mattered to me. It just did. Gideon helped. He showed up with a bag of groceries and didn't make Everett talk about any of it. They sat at the kitchen table and watched football and ate chili, and it was the most normal 2 hours I'd seen my son have in years. That's what a real friend does. The next morning, I called Caldwell and told him everything had changed. He said we needed to move on multiple fronts simultaneously, and that he wanted Everett in his office by end of day. Iris had already sent over her preliminary report. We had enough. What we filed in Marion County Superior Court over the next 2 weeks would take me too long to detail fully, but the summary is this: a petition to invalidate the power of attorney based on documented evidence of coercion and undue influence. A demand for an accounting of all business finances going back to the date of the business transfer. A motion to freeze the LLC accounts pending investigation. And a separate filing related to the house, which Caldwell believed we had a strong case on given the circumstances under which the refinance had occurred. Nora's attorney, a young man who seemed genuinely uncomfortable by the third meeting, requested multiple extensions. Each one was denied. I want to tell you about the morning the investigator called me with the bank records. I was in my backyard. It was early, maybe 6:30, and I was drinking coffee and watching the light come up over the neighbors' trees, the way Irene and I used to do on weekends. Iris's name came up on my phone and I answered it. She walked me through what she'd found. The refinanced equity. The $200,000 had been transferred in portions to 3 different accounts, one in Nora's name, one in Patrice's name, one in the name of the LLC. The LLC had been used to pay personal expenses, a new car for Patrice, payments on a property in Louisville that turned out to be Patrice's sister's house. And this is the detail that stopped me cold: monthly transfers to an account I didn't recognize. That account, Iris had traced, belonged to a man who turned out to be Patrice's son from a first marriage, a man neither Everett nor Nora had ever mentioned to me, who lived in Memphis, who had, according to public records, 2 prior felony convictions for wire fraud. I didn't say anything for a moment. Iris said, "Mr. Briggs, are you still there?" I said, "I'm here." She said, "I think this goes beyond civil court." She was right. The FBI field office in Indianapolis handles financial crimes jointly with the Indiana State Police. Caldwell had a contact. We met with a federal investigator named Tolliver, a quiet woman with reading glasses and a yellow legal pad, who listened to everything we had, asked several precise questions, and told us not to discuss the case with anyone outside the legal team. I don't know exactly what happened after that because I was not part of the investigation. That's how it works. You hand it over and you wait. What I do know is what Everett told me later. Patrice was arrested on a Tuesday morning at the house on Kessler Boulevard. 2 federal agents and 1 state police detective. The charges included wire fraud, financial exploitation, and conspiracy. Nora was taken in for questioning the same day. She was not charged immediately. She cooperated, which was the smart thing to do. But she was named as a subject in the civil proceedings. The LLC was dissolved by court order. The accounts were frozen. The business, Briggs HVAC Solutions, the company my son built, was returned to him under a court-supervised restoration order. The house remained in dispute for several more months, but ultimately the refinance was ruled fraudulent and reversed. The $200,000 was partially recovered, not all of it. The Memphis account had been drained, but enough. Patrice entered a plea agreement. 14 months in federal custody, 3 years supervised release, full restitution order. The restitution will take years to collect, but it's on record. It follows her. The morning the judge signed the final order restoring the business to Everett's sole ownership, I was sitting in the courtroom, second row. I'd worn my good sport coat, the navy one Irene had picked out for me at Macy's the Christmas before she got sick. Everett signed the paperwork at the plaintiff's table. When he was done, he turned around and looked at me. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. He just nodded once, the kind of nod that means 100 things at once. I thought about the night I found him in that truck behind the gas station, the way he'd stared at the dashboard, the 11 days he'd slept in his own vehicle because the people he trusted had taken everything he had and then taken the 4 walls around him too. I thought about Cooper, my grandson who'd been standing on a median strip in 41-degree weather with no jacket, who was now enrolled in a good daycare in Carmel and sleeping in a real bed in a real apartment, and who, when I came to pick him up on Saturdays, ran to the door and said "Pop," like the word was made just for that moment. People ask me sometimes what I would say to other fathers, or grandfathers, or anyone, watching someone they love disappear into a situation like this, watching the slow erosion, not knowing if what they're seeing is real or if they're the problem, the way they'd been told they were. I'd say trust what you know, not what you're told. What you know. I knew my son. I knew the way he talked, the way he carried himself, the way he answered the phone. When those things changed, I noticed. When I was told I was imagining it, I didn't argue. I started writing things down. That's the other thing I'd say. Write it down. Date it. Everything, because when the time comes, and if your instinct is telling you something is wrong, the time will come. A yellow legal pad full of dates and names and details is worth more than anything you think you're going to remember. I'm 67 years old. I spent 40 years as a building contractor, which means I spent 40 years looking at structures and asking one question: where is this load being carried? And is the foundation strong enough to hold it? That's all I did here. I looked at the structure. I found where it was weak, and I held it up until my son could stand on his own again. Irene would have done the same thing faster, honestly. She always saw people more clearly than I did, but she wasn't here, so I did what I could with what I had. That's all any of us can do. Cooper turns 3 next month. We're having a party at my house, just the family, Everett, Gideon, and his kids, my sister and her husband, down from Fort Wayne. I'm going to make the same potato salad I made at every 4th of July when Everett was growing up. He asked me specifically. Said Cooper would probably just eat the macaroni and cheese, but that wasn't the point. He was right. It's not the point. The point is, we're still here, all of us, at the same table, and nobody is sleeping in a truck. And the business is running again, booked 6 weeks out, with 2 new hires Everett brought on in the spring. And at that red light on Meridian Street, if I close my eyes, I can still see her standing there on that median. Still see the cardboard sign. Still see Cooper's face pressed against her shoulder with no jacket on. I don't close my eyes at that light anymore. I just drive through it. But I remember. Some things you hold on to not because they hurt, but because they remind you why you didn't stop moving when it would have been easier to look away. I didn't look away, and neither did my son. I still think about that moment in the parking lot behind the Speedway on Michigan Road. My son, sitting in the passenger seat of my truck, staring at the dashboard like a man trying to remember who he used to be. He'd built something real, a business, a home, a family, and piece by piece it had been taken from him by people he trusted with everything. The worst part wasn't the money. It was that they'd made him believe he deserved it. That's the thing about what happened to Everett that I keep coming back to. Nora and Patrice didn't take what they took through brute force. They took it through patience and precision. They worked on his sense of reality first. Who was telling the truth? Who really loved him? Who was the problem? Once they had that, the paperwork was easy. A man who doesn't trust his own instincts will sign almost anything. I've thought about whether I could have seen it earlier. Probably. There were signs I explained away because I wanted to think well of people. That was my failure, and I own it. What I've learned, what this whole thing carved into me, is that caring about someone isn't the same as watching out for them. You can love a person deeply and still not pay close enough attention. Real protection requires you to stay uncomfortable, to ask the question twice, to write down what you notice even when you feel foolish doing it. Everett had integrity from the day he was born. He was the kind of kid who told the truth even when it cost him. That didn't change as an adult. It just got turned against him. The people who exploit honest men count on that honesty. They know a good person will extend the benefit of the doubt further than they should, will blame themselves before they blame others, will try to fix things quietly rather than make noise. Everett did all of that, and it nearly buried him. What pulled him through wasn't luck. It was that underneath everything they'd stripped away, he still had his character. When I found him in that truck, he was broke, locked out of his own house, sleeping behind a gas station. But he wasn't broken. He was ashamed and exhausted and lost, but he was still himself. That's the one thing they couldn't refinance and transfer into someone else's name. What I'd say to anyone watching this, anyone who feels like they're in the middle of something they don't have the words to explain yet. Trust takes years to build and weeks to dismantle, but the person you are underneath the damage is more durable than you think. The clearest thinking I ever did in my life was during the worst of this. Grief and fear have a way of cutting through everything unnecessary. You find out what you actually know, and you act on it. Everett is booked 6 weeks out now. He hired 2 new guys in the spring. Cooper calls me Pop and runs to the door on Saturday mornings and eats approximately 4 bites of everything on his plate before losing interest completely. We're all still here, and that, in the end, is the whole answer.